YouTube, what the crap's going on? HeirofCarthage here, and I'm going to start a video that has been long overdue. And I say start because I actually intend to do multiple parts to this, because I want to make it very special. So I did faction focuses for all the factions in Total War Rome 2, but post-Emperor Edition, I didn't get back to all of them. And I never did one for Carthage in the first place because I was kind of saving them for last. So let's start talking Carthage. Carthage Faction Focus. I haven't gotten to play a lot of battles with Carthage recently, so the battle footage I have for you is from another player who sent it in, and it's good battle footage. But like I said, this will be multi-part. I will play with Carthage. I'll show you some videos, and if you all think you have some great videos with Carthage, send them to me. I don't know how many parts this faction focus will be, but probably 2 or 3. First, let's just talk through, I mean, it should be pretty obvious at this point what the roster of Carthage is, but for those of you maybe not as familiar with the game, I'll break down a few things about the Carthage faction. One, they are probably a mid to lower tier faction in terms of in the hands of equally skilled players in competitive play. So again, if 2 players have exactly equal skill, Carthage is going to be on the lower end of factions in terms of just the straight faction strength. Now, let's talk through why that is and what things that they do better than others. So, what about their general choices? So they actually have good general choices. This is one area in which I like Carthage. They have this bodyguard, which is just a heavy command unit. These can be handy for taking out skirmishers, and it's a cheap place to put your general if you don't want to spend a lot of money on him. Noble cavalry. Not a very common choice, but it gives you another choice. Noble cavalry are woefully overpriced for what you get out of them, but sometimes, very, very rarely, you can find a use for them, so it's nice to have it as an option. And the last option is an African war elephant. The only other nice thing that I would have liked to have seen for a general option for Carthage would have been maybe a sacred band unit. Something like that would have been kind of cool. Or the other thing that kind of irritates me is that they put in a noble cavalry, but they never really put in like a sacred band melee cavalry, which would have been nice. So I don't know, not a huge deal, but in any case, melee infantry. So what's the good and the bad? The bad is that Carthaginian mid-tier swords are outclassed by pretty much every barbarian faction, the Lusitani, Rome, Odrysian Kingdom. I mean, you name it. Arverni, Tylus, Galatia. You're out. I mean, they have decent mid-tier infantry. These Libyan infantry are not awful. It's just that they're outclassed by pretty much everyone else. So you don't really have the punching power in mid-tier swords like a lot of the good factions do. Good mid-tier swords define most of the best factions in Total War Rome 2. The example being Rome themselves. Arverni, Lusitani have great mid-tier swords. Yes, they're light, but they're still very powerful. You've got Odrysian Kingdom with their Thracian warriors and their Thracian nobles, and you've got Tylus and, of all people, Boii. Good grief, they've got some good ones. So, yeah. So this mid-tier sword unit for Carthage is kind of one of their big Achilles heel. Now, what do they have to help make up for it? They have a lot of mercenary light infantry, which can be handy. So Gallic warriors, basically the purpose these guys serve is they can deliver a better charge at a pretty low cost. They're not as good as mercenary Celtic warriors, but they're decent. Iberian swordsmen are javelin support with decent sword melee stats against a unit, say like a Levy Freeman or a light hoplite. They're not going to be good at a whole lot else, but if these guys get around to flank with their javelins, or if they get a hold of elephants with their javelins, cavalry, this can be an excellent support unit. A little pricey for what you get out of them. Well, actually not so much when you consider how many javelins they get. They get 5 javelin volleys. The mercenary Italian swordsman, not quite as good as a Hastati, but what you do get with these guys, I believe, is a medium melee, or heavy melee infantry. So that mass makes a difference. Definitely makes a difference. Not as good as a Hastati, but a unit that can be relied on for maybe a little bit longer than, say, like a Gallic warrior or something else. Scutari is only medium infantry. Very nice attack stats on these guys, but where they start to lack is in armor, health, and other stuff. So they fall apart. So this is basically a slightly more offensive option than the Libyan infantry, but you sacrifice, obviously, armor and health to go with the mercenary Scutari. Mercenary Samnite warriors are basically you sacrifice offense for defense. So these guys can tank a lot more damage, but they cost more and they won't deal as much damage. So Mercenary Noble Fighters are the only real true offensive weapon in an infantry standpoint that Carthage has. They are very expensive for what you get out of them. The reason I say that is because Oathsworn cost roughly the same, and they come with Shield Wall, and they just have heavier stats in general. Now, the Mercenary Noble Fighters do have a better charge than Oathsworn, but Oathsworn are going to beat them in the armor. I think it's just the armor department. Let's double check that real quick. Yeah, they have 80 armor, 65 health, and 70 base morale. So yeah, it's armor and melee defense that I think Oathsworn are going to be better. Melee defense is 69 and 62. Yep, and then the weapon damage on Oathsworn is 45 as opposed to the 41. So the Oathsworn are going to deal more weapon damage. They're going to be have better armor, which actually does go a long way, and then Shield Wall goes a huge heck of a long way. So again, Carthage does have one decently viable sword option, but it's only the expensive option, and it's not as good as other people's expensive option. So that's a breakdown of their melee infantry. Because of what I've said here, this is what makes Carthage one of those mid to lower tier factions. Because Rome 2, the power factions are defined by excellent melee infantry, period. After the patch to Emperor Edition, that's just been the case. Now, Hoplites. What do they have in the Hoplite department? Libyans and late Libyans are probably the most useful of the Hoplites. Late Libyans are my favorite because the armor goes from 55 all the way up to 80 for only 30 more talents, which is quite the bargain. You also get a 30 bonus versus large. These units die to just about any other melee unit, but they're actually capable in melee against, say, like a Levy Freeman. The downside is they don't have javelins. The upside is they have Hoplite Wall and quite a lot of armor. Another downside is obviously their health and base morale, not real good, but it is a disciplined unit. So another handy trait that these things have. Now the rest of the Carthaginian Hoplites, pretty decent melee attack, and not bad for weapon damage. It's just these guys are going to get trounced by mid-tier swords, and the Carthaginian, the late Carthaginian Hoplite is just a variant with 5 more armor. Now Sacred Band would actually be a pretty viable infantry unit in certain scenarios if one of two things was the case. One, they were cheaper, say like about 1,000, more like one of the Illyrian noble hoplites, or if they would go ahead and give these guys maybe say 1 more weapon damage and 1 or 2 more melee attack for their current cost, it would make them very strong at 105 armor. But because of this weapon damage being 29, what that means is they do not have the elite hoplite spear that deals 8 armor piercing. This one only deals 5. So it makes the Sacred Band considerably weaker than some of their counterparts that are of similar nature. African pikemen, handy to have pikes with Carthage, but your only option is this expensive African pikeman. So that's kind of the downside to the pikes for Carthage. You have them, but you only have the one option. Now, from a skirmishing standpoint, javelin men are kind of worthless here, but they're relatively cheap. Libyan peltists, on the other hand, have 65 armor, and their melee attack and weapon damage is none too impressive, but at 44 melee defense, 65 armor, 50 health, these guys can take a little bit of punishment in melee and survive. It actually makes them a very flexible skirmisher unit for Carthage, and they come in at a cheaper price than Balearic Slingers, but clearly that armor that you get and the health, you sacrifice range and lethality. Now, these guys are lethal if they get close to you and unload a volley in close combat, but the Balearic Slingers and Cretan Archers are more lethal in general just because they have longer range and more ammunition. But they come at a cost, and they're limited to 3 each. Now, Shock Cavalry, the only thing you have is the Noble Cavalry. We already discussed these guys. If you take a look at their hitting power here, 37, 25, 10, 63, and then pull up something like a Thessalian Cavalry with Macedon. A Thessalian Cavalry only costs 740 and comes with, so we had what, the second tier stats here were 25, 10, 63, 14, 25, 10, 67, 15. So the Thessalian Cavalry at weapon damage, bonus versus large, charge bonus, and melee defense is equivalent or better in every category at 300 talents less. Armor is at 40, health 90, base morale 65, and if we pop back over here to this, it goes 60, 100, 65. So you get, what is that, same armor? No, more armor on the Noble Cav, little less health on the Thessalians. The base morale is very comparable. It's the same, in fact. So really, Thessalians just deal more damage for their price. Like, so for a little more money, you sacrifice a lot of the offensive stats. So, in my opinion, had Carthage been given noble cavalry that cost like 800 or even 850 as opposed to the 1020, it would have made Carthage a lot more dangerous faction, but they do not. And the stats on these guys are just disappointing. In terms of other cavalry, you get Mercenary Celtic Light Horse, which is a decent light cav option if you need light cavalry, which in the current state of Rome 2, with all of the heavy mid-tier melee infantry, light cavalry is not as useful as it would have been maybe earlier on in the game. Mercenary Iberian Cav, again, you're going to find very little use for these guys in most multiplayer matches. The only thing that they're good at is hunting down very squishy skirmisher units. Their 50 attack and 39 damage allows them to destroy skirmisher units, but their 15 armor leaves them very vulnerable to skirmish units if they sit around or other cavalry. Carthaginian cavalry and Scutari cavalry are both medium cavalry of pretty good competency. For medium cavalry, they're pretty darn good medium cavalry, but there's so much good heavy cavalry for basically the same price in Rome 2 that these guys usually get trounced. Case in point, if we go over to the Arverni, this heavy cav unit at only a little bit more cost, which is 700, you get a heavy melee cav rather than medium, and the mass makes a huge difference. And you get a unit that is just overall better than the Carthaginian cavalry for the price. And it's also better versus infantry because that mass difference imparts more damage to infantry. So yes, Carthage has good medium melee cav. The problem is that in a game dominated by heavy infantry, medium melee cavalry is sometimes not what you want. They do have access to Mercenary Campanian Cavalry, which is a very powerful sword melee cavalry. But ever since Emperor Edition came around, giving infantry more staying power, so more health, armor, all that other kind of stuff, the Campanian Cavalry kind of lost their edge in combat. So when you're playing in a vanilla game, these guys are rarely a viable option because they are just too expensive for the kind of damage you're going to deal. Mercenary Numidian Cavalry, great javelin damage, but overpriced for what you get because they do not come with a secondary melee capability. So if you compare these guys to, say, a Galatian Raider, or other comparable like Germanic Scouts, all this other stuff, you get more cavalry for less. So Carthage kind of gets screwed in this department because Numidian cavalry were notorious for how good they were on the battlefield, and the ones in this game are overpriced and disappointing. And then when you get to the Mercenary Numidian Noble, this unit in the right hands can cause a lot of damage, but if it's two high-skill players against each other, it's not likely that these guys are going to be able to overcome something like a Levy Freeman. And for the price you pay, a very cheap Levy Freeman can ruin a very expensive Numidian Noble Cav. Two elephant options. You've got African elephants and African war elephants. Nice to be able to spend a little less money and still get an elephant and have these options. Obviously, this is one of the biggest killing tools that Carthage has is elephants. I'm not even going to talk about artillery because it really doesn't have any place in competitive multiplayer. That is Carthaginian faction. So again, mid to low tier overall because their lack of solid mid-tier melee infantry and their lack of heavy melee cavalry is really what hurts Carthage in terms of making them a power faction. What do they get, though? What are they good at? Carthage has a huge variety of specialized support troops. So really, you have to come up with a very crafty build and really just outmaneuver and outthink your opponent as Carthage because you're not usually just going to overpower them. And case in point, I've got a good replay to demonstrate that. Now this is a competitive match, it's a tournament match between Johann and I, who's playing as Tylus, and then Johann is Carthage. This is a pretty meta Tylus build here. Pretty close. I mean, there is a noble cavalry rather than just Galatian Raiders, but that's pretty common too. So few skirmisher units, 2 Oathsworn, 2 Thracian warriors, 4 tribals. Very dangerous Tylus army for Carthage to face. Now, Johann takes a very unconventional Carthaginian army, and he kind of walked through some of his thought process. Again, medium melee cav does not usually end up being terribly useful against heavy melee infantry, and so he decides just to not bring it. And he instead goes with several of these noble cavalry, which again, not normally a good choice, but he knows he's going to have to cause as much damage as possible, and you do get very heavy and the best charge for a Carthaginian cav. So this is a huge risk because he's tied up 4,000 talents. in all these cavalry, knowing that there's going to be Galatian raiders on the field. So this is a risk. What can he counter them with? He's got 5 of these Libyan peltists. And these guys, again, 65 armor lets them be a little more sturdy. He has 2 noble fighters because, again, he knows that's where his killing power is going to be in terms of infantry. And then he's got a line of mercenary Gallic warriors supported by 1 mercenary Italian swordsman. Again, that heavy infantry on the flank helps hold up the flank just a little bit longer. His general is just a general's bodyguard, so he cannot long-range skirmish. And what he has to do here with this army is, again, try and use the superior specialized support units of Carthage to isolate and destroy the Tylus army one piece at a time, preferably, because, again, a frontal engagement here still results in a pretty quick death for Carthage. So, as we watch Johann engage, he starts pushing a little bit towards this flank for Tylus. Now, the tools that Tylus has over here, they've got an Oathsworn and tribal warriors, and they are led by Levi Freeman. So they have excellent meat shields with javelins. They've got long-range skirmish support, and they have a heavy cavalry back here supporting. Now, the Galatian raiders kind of get a little bit out of position over here towards this flank that's not experiencing any action, and they're being screened off nicely by these Libyan peltists. So as we watch this engagement unfold, we have a mercenary Gallic warrior leading the charge because it's a better, cheaper throwaway unit for Carthage. It's got a decent charge for the throwaway price. The Libyan peltist here showing how they can absorb a little bit of fire and help push up for the main line. So here comes the engagement. The Gallic warriors are going to do well against Levi Freeman, and they're going to absorb the charge of the tribal warriors and also the Oathsworn. This noble cavalry connects here and then also does a little connection with the Oathsworn. 2 more noble cavalry quickly swinging around the flank. However, they took shots from this Thracian peltist, and they are damaged pretty badly. And then Johann just goes into a holding formation over here and basically wants to tie up this huge bunch of Tylus troops, and he's got that effectively done. While with his rear charges from shot cavalry over here, he can overwhelm one flank of Tylus. So again, specialty support units for Carthage being put to good use here. Now, I don't know that a noble cav is a particularly good specialty support unit, but it was the right choice for this build that he's facing. Does it come at a risk? Absolutely, because we know that Tylus is going to have good cheap units for destroying heavy cavalry, Levi Freeman. But the risk was worth it at this point, and he gets a reward. And his Italian swordsman, again, a heavy infantry, helping to hold up a little longer, and having blunted the Oathsworn charge with the Gallic warrior, his own noble fighter gets in and is getting quite a few kills. The noble horse has been engaged by a noble horse from, or the noble cavalry of Carthage has been engaged by this noble horse, but the peltists are great support here too, taking out noble horse very nicely with their javelins. Carthage is definitely taking a beating over here. But again, look at this. The heavy peltists are deterrent enough to keep some of the Galatian raiders at bay, and they're still lending quite a bit of support in this fight by hurling javelins into the flank. The Carthaginian general is just a bodyguard, but he's going to throw his weight around here. Actually running into Thracian warriors, probably not the best scenario there. You can see that these raiding horsemen are still around, and the raiding horsemen are going to be a challenge for Carthage. They will run out of ammo eventually. The good news is they're light. The bad news is they have pretty decent melee statistics. The Carthaginian general is basically sacrificing himself to silence these Thracian peltists, which is a good choice. These guys can cause a lot of damage, but these slingers back here are also going to probably kill the Carthaginian general at any moment. But the Tylus general is already dead. And that, you can see, is starting to weigh into the morale of some of these cheaper units. You can see that these skirmishers are already down to red morale and yellow morale for the raiding horsemen. The other benefit of bringing these noble fighters is that they have the Encourage aura, and it's really going to help out a lot. I'm trying to find one of the Italian sword units. Here's one over here. They're not disciplined. Okay, I just wanted to take a look at that. Yeah, look at these peltists keeping this tribal warrior busy. Very nice to keep it away from the fight. And then here, the Gallic warriors and the noble fighters are tying down tribal warriors and Oathsworn while being rear charged by noble cavalry. Most of the noble cavalry for Carthage is almost gone, but he's going to put some more of it to good use here. This tribal warrior was doing very nicely in this fight against the noble fighters, but getting hit by a very heavy shot cavalry is going to be very damaging to even heavy sword units. So the tribal warrior there without the general falling into red morale. And since the rest of the army is falling apart, it's really starting to hurt the morale of the Tylus player. Again, still doing decently in terms of morale, but as more units, look at that, got hit from behind, so it starts to give attacked in the rear penalties, and the armies of Tylus just start to fall apart. So you can see that Carthage was able to use those specialty units. They overwhelmed the flank of Tylus. This army is very risky, but as you can tell here, Johann probably made this choice because he felt like, hey, I've got to choose this type of army if I'm going to win with Carthage, and I'm just going to have to outplay the other player. And he did mention that obviously in the hands of an equally skilled player that this would be a huge risk and that he has lost several times doing something like this. So it's not a always win type army, but it is a way to try and use Carthage a little more effectively in competitive play by basically throwing your enemy off balance with an army build that they don't expect that will counter what they have brought in one of those meta builds from a barbarian a little bit better. Again, this is not going to be a win every time scenario. It's just basically maximizing your potential with Carthage. Hope you all enjoyed this one. Really appreciate Johann sending this one in. It was a great battle to talk about Carthage kind of as a faction focus. I will come back with another part of the faction focus. What else do you think I should talk about with Carthage? What else do you want to know? Should I look at them a little bit in campaign and do some of the faction focus from a campaign standpoint? Or do you just want to hear a little bit more how to use them in multiplayer play? Or do you want me to hear talking about them maybe just, I don't know, just give me your thoughts and I will listen to it. Again, thanks to Johann. Hope you all enjoyed the battle. HeirofCarthage signing.